Hello there everyone, welcome to the channel if you're new, welcome back if you aren't. I am EDJ, and we are continuing with Kings and Generals Caesar series. So now we're getting to the Parthian invasion of Rome. I do know that Antony's invasion of Parthia was a complete disaster that resulted in a lot of death, but I guess this is the prelude to the big Parthian in Rome issue, so yeah, overall we'll see how Parthia does. Because Parthia kind of becomes a rival to Rome in a sense, right? Like a constant enemy. And just from that, the further east is where a lot of conflict will eventually come to the Roman Empire. So, yeah, overall, it's gonna be cool to see Parthia in action. And I don't really have much else to say. It is interesting that Julius Caesar wanted to go to Parthia. I wonder how that would have went. They also were responsible for the death of one of the triumvirates of the first one, Crassus, I think is his name. So yeah, Parthia obviously is its own way a threat, so yeah, I guess we'll just see more about them, and I guess the structure of how they fight and what makes them such a formidable enemy, right? Yeah, so I don't really have much else to add. If you want to watch the original video, the link's always down in the description. And with that said, let's just get to it. Let's watch, Pompeian? Parthian invasion of Rome.
In the previous episode of this series, we followed Octavian in the west, from the end of Philippi in 42 BC through the Parisine War until the Treaty of Brundisium in late 40 BC. At the same time, however, events were transpiring in the east, and in this episode, we shall again begin in the immediate aftermath of Philippi, this time focusing on Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and the eventual Pompeian Parthian invasion, which was a harbinger of what was to come for the next centuries of Roman history. We can offer a sneak preview of those centuries. Following the division of lands and legions that occurred after Philippi, Octavian returned to Italy, while Antony briefly wintered in Athens, enjoying the literary and philosophical pleasures of the city before crossing to Asia Minor in the spring of 41 BC. Much of the area had sworn allegiance to Brutus and Cassius, and it was up to Antony to re-establish control over these provinces, as well as collect the funds to cover the triumvir's colossal expenses. For cities that had sided with the liberators, such as many of the Ionian cities, a heavy tribute of 9 years' worth of taxes was demanded. Kings, tyrants, and vassals who had sided against him were replaced with pro-Caesarians. Powerful Romans, such as governors, came to him asking for mercy, Antony sparing most of these, except any that had been involved in or knew about the conspiracy to assassinate Caesar. At the same time, Antony was also careful to reward those who had remained loyal. The Rhodians, for example, were given more land, and he exempted the Lycians from taxes. It was a rare insight into how talented an administrator Antony could be, using threats and mercy in...
Yeah, you know, I will say, the portrayal, I'm sorry I keep bringing up the Rome HBO show. The portrayal of Antony is spectacular, the actor just nails it. Though I will say that he's portrayed a bit more brutish, and kind of like, obviously Antony was a drunkard, a party dude, you know, I guess sort of a womanizer, yeah? And you know, the show gets those parts right, but it does highlight mainly those attributes that it almost makes you wonder how he made it so far, right? And, you know, it's almost like this brutish dude, how did he make it? I do think that there are positive attributes of Antony. I think he's not the greatest politician, mind you, but I think he could at times be pretty good in his own right. Obviously not to the caliber of an Augustus or even Caesar, but you know, I don't think he's as bad as I think some would say. Not to say he's perfect, mind you, or great, it's just I think he had his moments where he could definitely play the game and be a shrewd politician in his own right, you know.
Equal measure to quickly bring many of the eastern provinces back into the fold. During his journey around the provinces of Asia Minor, Antony was already planning for an invasion of Parthia, an invasion for which Egypt, Rome's most powerful vassal in the east, would be vital. As such, he requested that Cleopatra meet him in Cilicia. It is unlikely that this was the first time the two had met, as Antony had probably met Cleopatra when she lived in Rome for a time as Caesar's lover. However, it was apparently at this meeting that Antony, like Caesar before him, fell for Cleopatra's wit and beauty. Antony spent the summer in Syria, replacing tyrants and nobles who had sided with the liberators with pro-Caesarians, many of the deposed men fleeing to Parthia. Once this administration was handled, Antony travelled to Alexandria to spend the winter with his new lover Cleopatra. As he had in Athens, Antony spent his time in Alexandria frequenting schools, temples, and other places of learning, enjoying and embracing the Greek style of dress and way of life. He also spent a lot of time with Cleopatra, which eventually resulted in twins, Alexander and Cleopatra. His affinity for the Greek lifestyle and affair with Cleopatra would later be scorned by ancient historians.
Yeah, I think he started also dressing like Egyptian. He almost embraced, he really went all in with Cleopatra. I do genuinely believe that he loved her. And I guess Cleopatra must have loved him back, to back him up as much as she did, and, essentially, I think he was accused, right, of not being Roman, or, abandoning Rome to be something else, I guess, and you're kind of seeing it. So yeah, that was a big source of criticism. He also kind of wanted to leave basically the eastern half of Rome to make his own and kind of give it to his children with Cleopatra, which was just not well received at all.
And wrote that he cared less and less for Roman affairs, obliging every one of Cleopatra's demands. Cassius Dio referred to Antony as Cleopatra's slave, and Plutarch wrote that Cleopatra
Mark Antony's Cleopatra's simp. I'm still thinking of the Dovahani portrayal where he's basically a simp for Cleopatra, which is the funniest thing ever. But yeah, I guess that's kind of what happens when you fall in love. You kind of just go all in. And Cleopatra obviously could woo people with her brilliant intelligence and, great, overall charm. And I imagine she was just a great conversationalist, so she had a lot going for her, right? Even if you want to argue she wasn't beautiful physically, personality goes a long way in making someone hot. So Cleopatra personality was probably if true she wasn't that great looking, then her personality just amplified, her attractiveness. So yeah.
Dissipated and destroyed what good and saving qualities Antony had. These assessments are damning, but it is important to note that Roman sources such as these were almost uniformly scathing of powerful women, and also influenced by later Augustan propaganda.
Yeah.
Whether such claims about their relationship are true or not is impossible to say with certainty, but the alliance between the triumvir and queen was at least initially beneficial to both parties. On the one hand, Antony benefited from making sure that he had a strong Egyptian ally that he could rely upon for supplies and logistics to support his Parthian campaign. On the other, Cleopatra was able to use Antony's power to further her own position and remove her rivals, notably having her sister Arsinoe killed on Antony's orders.
There's a growing interest in socialism among young people in America, but do they know about its...
It was while Antony was in Alexandria, sometime in early 40 BC, that the Parthians began raiding Syria, led by Quintus Labienus, son of the renowned Titus Labienus, and the Parthian prince Pacorus. The precise size of the army is hard to distinguish, but it is hinted at being approximately 20,000, consisting of a mix of cataphracts and horse archers. Lucius Decidius Saxa, the governor Antony had appointed to the province, quickly gathered an army, likely around 2 legions, to fight the invaders, but was easily defeated in open battle by the more numerous Parthians and their excellent cavalry, with the Roman eagles being captured. Saxa fled to Antioch and then Cilicia, but was soon caught and executed. Despite Antony's efforts in the east, there were still many Pompeian sympathizers, particularly in Syria, which had previously been Cassius's province. Moreover, Quintus Labienus's father had been an incredibly popular Pompeian military leader, and the Parthians brought with them a number of the Pompeians Antony had deposed. As a result, with Saxa dead, many garrisons and cities in Syria welcomed Quintus, surrendering without a fight, including Antioch. The force then split, Labienus pushing into Cilicia and Asia Minor, while Pacorus focused on subjugating the rest of Syria. With next to no resistance, he was able to seize control of almost the entire province, save for the notoriously well-defended city of Tyre, and pushed on to the Roman tributary of Judea, installing the anti-Roman Antigonus II as king. Labienus, meanwhile, was able to win over many cities in Cilicia, only facing serious resistance from Mylassa and Alabanda, both of which repelled initial attacks before eventually being taken and sacked. All of this had taken place in only a matter of months. Antony had thus far failed to act, either due to laziness and being too distracted by the luxury.
Yeah, I was about to say, they've basically just taken all of this with astounding speed and very little opposition. I'm like, Antony, this is your place, what are you doing? And I remember, oh yeah, he's chilling with Cleopatra, his Egyptian baddie, you know? So, yeah, I'm like, Antony, you gotta do something, bro. Like, there's chaos going on.
Luxuries of Alexandria, as Cassius Dio says, or because the Parthians had moved too fast for Antony to muster a concerted response. Either way, it wasn't until spring that he sailed from Alexandria to Tyre to address the issue. However, it was at this point that he received news of his brother and wife's defeat in Italy and of the loss of Gaul to Octavian. With his political position in jeopardy, Antony rushed back to Italy with the majority of his legions, effectively abandoning the eastern provinces. Their absence allowed Labienus to make even greater gains, pushing through the southern coast of Asia Minor to Ionia. Even Mithridates VI, one of the great enemies of Rome, had not been so successful.
I know, Labienus is just making waves. Look at how fast he's moving. This is insane.
Despite Octavian and Antony managing to reconcile with the Treaty of Brundisium and Antony's marriage to Octavia, Sextus Pompey still presented a problem. The piracy and blockades of his fleet continued, and so did the famines. While Antony and Octavian were in Rome, the people, now at a breaking point, rioted in the Forum. Octavian, attempting to calm the crowd, was pelted with stones and attacked, forcing Antony to intervene, bringing soldiers into the Forum. The soldiers held back the crowd, but also killed some of the civilians, triggering a panic that resulted in the deaths of even more. It was clear that this could not continue. To prepare for peace talks, Octavian married Scribonia, the sister of Libo, one of Sextus's closest advisors. It was Libo who had facilitated the earlier alliance between Antony and Sextus, and he was once again vital, arranging a meeting of the three in Misenum at the start of 39 BC. The negotiations started off poorly, Sextus assuming he would be offered a place in the triumvirate instead of Lepidus, which Antony and Octavian flatly refused. The negotiations continued, Antony and Octavian agreeing to forgive any who had been proscribed and to return part of their property to them. Many in Sextus's camp had been proscribed, and upon hearing this, they immediately jumped at the chance, pressuring Sextus to accept. Sextus had hoped to draw out negotiations, knowing that the famine put him in a powerful position that would only become stronger the longer he waited. Under the mounting pressure from his own faction, though, Sextus was forced to make peace quickly. The trio had agreed to the following. Sextus would cease his blockades and piracy, remove any troops he still had in continental Italy, and immediately send grain to Rome. In return, the proscribed Pompeians would be allowed to return to Rome and have 1/4 of their property restored. The many slaves that Sextus had welcomed into his army would be freed and rewarded fully upon completing their term of military service. And finally, Sextus would be allowed to govern Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and Achaia. The treaty was sealed by another marriage, Sextus's daughter Pompeia to Octavian's nephew Marcellus, the son-in-law of Antony. For how powerful a position Sextus had going into the negotiations, it was a relatively poor deal. He already had effective...
Yeah, I was about to say, the dude basically had Italy besieged, right? So yeah, he basically lost that. And it's funny because Pompey the Great was basically pressured to give that battle to Caesar, right? Which ultimately he lost and led to his demise, even though he wanted to, you know, kind of rely on the Fabian strategy and wear out Caesar. And you kind of see it like here, this Pompey's also just kind of peer pressured into giving up something that was advantageous to him. So that seems to be a fun little, I guess, link between the two.
Control of Sicily, Sardinia, and with his naval supremacy, likely could have taken Corsica with ease. The only real benefit he got was Achaia. Sextus was well aware of this and was furious at the advisors who had pressured him to accept, rather than allowing him to wait for better terms. Part of his faction even suggested that he act now and kill both Octavian and Antony, but Sextus refused.
And over the whole world rose a clamor of hysterical joy.
World War I promised us a...
Meanwhile, Octavian and Antony had benefited from the treaty massively. The recalling of Sextus's ships and the grain he sent quickly ended the famine, and the two triumvirs returned to a hero's welcome in Rome. With affairs in Italy settled for now, Antony had quartered himself in Athens, simultaneously monitoring affairs in Italy and mustering his forces for a huge counter-invasion of Parthia, selecting his general Ventidius to confront Labienus and Pacorus. This was the same Ventidius that had been in Italy while Lucius Antony was besieged in Perusia and had not come to his aid. He was a novus homo, a new man, who had started as a mule driver before joining the army and serving under Caesar in Gaul. Little else is known about his early life, but he seems to have caught Caesar's eye as he was assigned as a praetor by the dictator in 43 BC. Since Caesar's assassination, he had also proved himself loyal to Antony, and was one of the men Antony relied upon in the lead-up to Mutina years earlier. He had held military commands, but never had control over a full campaign as he now did. The fact that Antony, a sound military strategist, entrusted command to him shows not only the level of trust Antony had in Ventidius, but perhaps also that Ventidius had correctly done what Antony would have wanted by not supporting Lucius. At the start of spring 39 BC, Ventidius crossed into Asia Minor with a force of probably 4 legions, alongside a sizable number of light infantry, aiming to establish a foothold for Antony. Though Labienus had moved quickly and seized a lot of land, he had thus far not been able to consolidate his position and had distanced himself significantly from his Parthian allies in Syria. The only force he had with him were local auxiliaries who had sided with him and perhaps 2 legions from Syria. Confronted with Ventidius's larger force, Labienus had little option but to retreat back to Cilicia to try and join forces with a portion of the Parthian force in Syria. Ventidius pursued, splitting his army and leading the light infantry and cavalry ahead to try and cut off Labienus. Ventidius was able to overtake Labienus around the Taurus Mountains, encamping on the high ground. Ventidius was hesitant to attack with only his light infantry, and so a standoff ensued, Ventidius waiting for his heavy infantry and Labienus for his Parthian allies. This carried on for almost a week, until the reinforcements for both sides arrived apparently on the same day.
Wow.
Ventidius kept his entire force on the high ground, but the reinforcing Parthians, buoyed by their victory over Saxa the previous year, did not wait to coordinate an attack with Labienus, forming up at the base of the hill for battle. The standard Roman military doctrine was to draw up for battle in front of an encampment so as not to be surrounded, as can be seen from Caesar's tactics at Sella, for instance. Ventidius, though, kept his force in camp. Encouraged by this perceived cowardice, the Parthians began to charge up the incline. Once they were part way up the slope, however, Ventidius suddenly ordered his men to sally out and attack.
Yeah, that was dumb. They were too arrogant right there, and obviously attacking a force on high ground is never a good idea, right? So I just imagine this is gonna be a slaughter.
Caught unawares and fighting uphill, The Parthian cavalry stood little chance against the heavy Roman infantry, and many were killed before quickly routing. The stampede of horses downhill caused even more casualties, and the Parthians fled the field completely, leaving Labienus and his men deployed in battle formation outside their camp. Ventidius marshaled his forces once again, but did not attack Labienus. The latter had been relying upon the Parthians for the battle, and with them routed, it is peculiar that Ventidius did not press home his advantage, though he may have wanted to avoid exhausting his men, or perhaps attempted to negotiate with Labienus to surrender. Whichever the reason, both forces returned to their encampments for the night. At this point, Labienus attempted to slip away in the darkness, but deserters from his camp informed Ventidius of this. He quickly took action, ambushing Labienus's retreating force in the night, killing a number of them and capturing the rest. What exactly happened to Labienus next is unclear. Cassius says he was able to slip away, but was soon arrested and executed, while Festus claims he was killed in the ambush. Whatever the case, it is clear that Ventidius had won an impressive victory, thus securing Asia Minor.
Dang, Ventidius, good job, my guy. I don't know anything about this man. I didn't know he existed before this video, but dang, you can definitely see why Caesar took note of him and Mark Antony. Like, he just stopped Labienus, who was basically wreaking havoc, so good job, Ventidius, dude.
In order to safeguard Cilicia against any counterattack, Ventidius marched his force to the Amanus Pass, bordering Syria. Finding it garrisoned by the Parthians, Ventidius had 2 legions wait in ambush, while he sent a force of cavalry ahead to provoke the Parthians. The Roman cavalry feigned a retreat, luring the Parthians directly into Ventidius's trap. The legions sprung to the attack, killing many.
This dude's really great at ambushes. Like, man, he's the master of ambushing so far, because he's like... Then again, it helps that the Parthians seem a bit too headstrong. They just seem to rush into combat. So, yeah, Ventidius is using that to his advantage.
The Parthians, including their commander, and routing the rest. Upon hearing news of their second defeat, Pacorus, the Parthian prince, withdrew the remainder of his forces from Syria. Ventidius was thus able to retake the remainder of the province without a fight.
Wow.
Ventidius then began the process of re-administering the provinces, including sending a small detachment of his force to Herod, the Roman-supported son of the deposed king of Judea, in order to try and retake the kingdom from the Parthian-installed Antigonus. The Parthian invasion had only been stalled, though. It had not been completely halted.
But yeah, Ventidius essentially... Oh, I know a lot about Herod. For those of you who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in theology, and, you know, I know a lot about biblical history, and I do know about the family line of Herod. I try not to talk about, you know, theology on this channel. I say that for my main channel, which, you know, you could find on my main page of this channel. My main channel is called Edwin de Jesus. I talk about the Bible and all that. So, you know, the only thing I'm an expert in talking about is biblical, you know, theology and theology as a whole. But, you know, obviously I can never really showcase that in this channel, because this channel I'm focusing on areas outside of what I've studied. So yeah. But yeah, Herod is very interesting, and there are, you know, there are several Herods. You know, the most famous one is usually the one who, you know, called, you know, murdered all the babies when Jesus was born. You know the story. And, you know, there's Herod Agrippa, and yeah, the Herods, for the most part... Sorry, I thought my phone was ringing. You know, the Herods as a part, they have an interesting history with Rome, kind of being, you know, under Rome through the time of, you know, the late Republic and the early Empire through the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So there's a lot of interesting things. I won't go into a thing because that's not the point, but I was thinking about making a video on my other channel about the Herods and Rome, so, you know. Yeah.
At the start of the following year, 38 BC, Pacorus began amassing a second invasion force, totaling between 20 and 30,000 soldiers. At this time, Ventidius's legions were still in their winter quarters, and some in Cappadocia. According to Cassius Dio, in order to buy himself more time, Ventidius used a local prince who was known to be close to the Parthians to spread disinformation. The prince claimed that Ventidius was not afraid of the Parthians crossing the Euphrates in their usual place near Zeugma, saying that the legions would easily be able to hold the crossing thanks to the hilly terrain, but that he was worried about the Parthians crossing further down the river, where the flat plains would make it difficult for his men to fight the Parthian cavalry. Pacorus, as a result of this, aimed for the flat plains, wasting as many as 40 days marching his army downstream and building a bridge. This was enough time for Ventidius to muster his forces and be prepared for the invasion. Though this is the version of events given by Cassius Dio, some modern historians have questioned it. They point out justifiably that our only source for the events is Roman, and thus would have an undeniable bias against the Parthians, depicting them as gullible and easily fooled. Pacorus was a talented commander, and some therefore think it is unlikely that he would have been so easily hoodwinked. It has also been suggested that Pacorus deliberately waited for Ventidius to amass his legions in order to be able to hopefully strike one decisive blow and destroy the Roman army in the east in one battle. In either scenario, the outcome is the same. Ventidius had enough time to gather his army to counter Pacorus. The forces met around Mount Gindaris, Ventidius once again encamping on the high ground. His army of perhaps 4 legions plus light infantry was approximately the same size as Pacorus's, but since his victories the previous year, Ventidius had also incorporated slingers into his army, likely from local populations. When the Parthians drew up for battle, Ventidius once again used the same ploy as before, keeping his army inside their camp to lure the Parthians close. The Parthian horse archers advanced up the slope first, and Ventidius waited until the last moment to unleash part of his force. Some of the Parthians were caught by this sally and cut down. The remainder
They are not learning from their mistakes, these Parthians. And Ventidius is just kind of doing the same thing effectively, right? Like, if it works, why not just keep doing it? Like, dang. This dude is just wrecking the Parthians solo.
Past the Roman fort with part of Ventidius's force in pursuit. Pacorus, assuming that his horse archers had lured out the entirety of Ventidius's army, now advanced uphill towards the camp with his cataphracts. Suddenly, Ventidius attacked with the remainder of his legions and slingers. With the advantage of the high ground, they were able to easily blunt the charge of the cataphracts and repel them, forcing them back down the hill. Pacorus was able to rally his men at the base of the hill and organized a proper resistance. The Parthians, however, found themselves under a hail of missiles from the Roman slingers on the high ground, and Pacorus was killed in the fighting. Some of his guard fought fiercely for his body, but a combination of Roman heavy infantry and intense fire from the slingers proved too much, the Parthian army breaking completely.
Wow.
Parts of the army attempted to flee back across the Euphrates, but were cut off and killed, others successfully managing to reach the safety of Commagene, a Parthian ally. The majority of the Parthian army, however, had been killed. Ventidius's casualties are unknown, but they seem to have been minimal, as he immediately marched to Commagene and besieged the capital. Antony arrived from Greece.
Dude, Ventidius carried. He literally soloed Parthian Labienus. Dude, that's amazing. I didn't know this about this dude, but he just showed up and just reversed the entire situation, which is just spectacular. The finesse, right? Like, amazing.
Soon afterwards, taking over the siege and accepting tribute from the Commagene king in return for peace. Antony seems to have been somewhat jealous of Ventidius's achievements, and not without reason. Ventidius had won 3 battles in succession, including Rome's first victory over a full Parthian army, and the death of Pacorus sparked a succession crisis in Parthia, further securing Rome's eastern border. Antony removed the general from command, and Ventidius returned to Rome a hero, becoming the first Roman to be awarded a triumph for a victory over the Parthians.
Wow. That's amazing. The first to take on a Parthian force and be given a triumph. Man, I can't believe I didn't know this dude existed. These are amazing achievements.
Ventidius then disappears from the historical record, the assumption being that he
He shows up, defeats Parthia, gets a triumph, no further explanation, just fades from history, no explanation. What a Chad.
died soon afterwards, though whether by natural causes or not is unknown. The death of Quintus Labienus meant that there was effectively only one Pompeian leader left, Sextus Pompey.
Dude, you are resilient. I'll give that to you, Sextus Pompey. You've been around since this early series, and the fact that you are still around amazes me. Talk about resilient.
And while Ventidius had been securing the east, the peace that had been agreed at Misenum had frayed quickly. While Antony was in Athens, Sextus had requested control of the province of Achaia as agreed. In return, Antony demanded the tax revenue of the province in order to fund his Parthian campaign, a demand that Sextus refused. To make matters worse for Sextus, one of his generals and governors, Menas, had defected to Octavian, handing over control of Sardinia and 3 legions. In response, Sextus had once again sent out his fleet to pirate the Mediterranean, and by the start of 38 BC, the peace was in tatters. War, once again, loomed on the horizon. We shall cover this war between the Caesarians and Sextus Pompey in the upcoming episode.
So yeah, very short-lived peace. But yeah, I think eventually Agrippa's the one who takes out Sextus, right? Agrippa, being the Chad he is, just makes his own navy. You know, I think he even flooded the land so he could have mock training with the navy. Agrippa's a Chad. I love Agrippa. He's amazing. But we'll be covering that next time, guys. So I'll see you then. Goodbye.